Good morning and welcome to our second week of engaging each other virtually around these very interesting questions and some of the issues that have been raised by the pandemic. Um, I had hoped to get this out to you earlier, but I have been feeling a little bit under the weather myself, and the video modality requires a certain level of energy, I think, in order to be engaging and effective. So I hope you will excuse the fact that it's taken a little while to get this up. I wanted to do a couple of things. First, I wanted to thank you for the increased depth in which you have been responding to the questions in the first discussion forum. I think the discussion is finally kind of beginning to move into a deeper engagement with the questions posed by the pandemic. So I appreciate that. And I want to urge you to continue that into the second week and the third week and on. Um, Second, I want to talk a little bit about the context of the questions that I'm posing in the second discussion forum, the forum about the pandemic and climate change. For those of you who either have not yet had a chance to read the articles I've posted, the videos I've posted, or perhaps are having a little bit of difficulty wading through the complexity, one of the things that climate change is likely to produce is an increased number of pandemics. There are a number of reasons for this. It has to do with the way in which the warming of the climate is melting the permafrost in the Arctic regions, the areas that usually remain completely frozen, which harbor lots of pathogens from the past that have otherwise been eradicated, like smallpox. Some of it has to do with the loss of habitat and changes in ecosystems, which lead to animals moving into different places than they lived before and engaging human beings in a different way, leading to viruses jumping from animals to human beings. And obviously all of that is layered over the movement of human animals that is globalization, the fact that everybody now is always every place. And so the kinds of things that in the past generated large-scale pandemics, such as the Black Death in the European High Middle Ages, or the essentially genocidal pandemic of smallpox in the Americas after the European conquests. Things like that that happened slow motion in the past are now happening at a much more accelerated pace. That's combined with people rapidly moving from the countryside into the cities, increasing the intensity and density of human interactions. So one of the things that we can expect is that this is going to happen a lot more often. This is not the last time, and it's not necessarily the worst. So I wanted to make that connection clear and to kind of prod you to think then about what it says about the human future and the human condition. We have tended to live in a world where we have expected continued advances of modern medicine to continue to extend the human lifespan. To the extent that we have gotten stuck with that, we have been told that it is largely a result of lifestyle diseases, lack of activity, poor diet, etc., or perhaps of some genetic limitations on human lifespan, which a lot of scientists believe probably is limited to around 120 years. Differences in terms of whether or not that can be extended or not. But the idea that we would have massive die-offs as a result of infectious diseases is something that most of us have been brought up to believe was a thing of the past. And that's unlikely to be true, even if we continue to make progress on some of the underlying lifestyle, metabolic whatever kinds of diseases that you want to call the things that we're pressed on day by day. Even if there are medical advances that offer potential life extension beyond the kind of hardwired genetic limits. So what does that mean in terms of our sense of the future? Human beings lived with that for millennia. What would it mean for us to once again live with it? And I'm kind of putting that question on the table. It wasn't included in the discussion board, but it's something I want you to think about and integrate, particularly as we get to a discussion of the more philosophical, cultural, spiritual questions that are raised by the pandemic. The other question that the connection between the pandemic and climate change raises is a pretty well-defined ethical dilemma or ethical trade-off. And that is that the vast majority of the planet's carbon footprint has been generated by the wealthiest countries, by the United States, Canada, countries of Europe, Japan maybe, and developing countries are now arguing that if they are required to meet the same carbon emission standards as those wealthy countries, they'll never have a chance to catch up economically. And that's not fair, that with the carbon emission standards that the international community is wanting to impose, they will never have a chance to reach the kind of consumption level which characterizes the United States or Europe or Japan today. And therefore, they're arguing that the bulk of the responsibility should rest on the wealthiest countries. On the other hand, people from the wealthier countries, or simply people who are inclined to believe that the climate crisis is the principal contradiction, the principal challenge of the present period, argue that the problem is so overwhelming and the potential for vastly increased carbon output from places like India and China is so vast that unless those countries respect those international standards, we're not going to make any real progress. In a certain sense, that even though it's the United States and Europe that did the damage, the United States and Europe are not going to be able to repair it alone. And that in a very real sense, this may well mean that global living standards will never be equalized at the current consumption levels that are typical in the United States and Europe. That places like India and China can't catch up, and that in fact we may need to scale down. So what I'm asking you to do is to weigh in on that question. What do you think about that? Where would you come down on that issue? And what principles would you invoke? Why? Think about how you would reason about that ethically. And I'm going to kind of use that to tease out some of the philosophical questions as we proceed that we were going to engage primarily by looking at some classical texts if we continued the class on site. And I may point you to those texts as we get there, as we get to that point. But I want to, at this point, proceed more Socratically, just ask you what you think, kind of prod you. And it's really important in that regard that you keep coming back to the discussion board. So I know that there are, actually a lot of things that we are all dealing with right now. And that, I don't want you to feel like I believe that this is your first and only responsibility. But the discussion will go best if you say something, you allow me to kind of poke and prod and challenge, and then you come back and really have a discussion, okay? And again, I've seen movement in that direction, but I want to encourage that as strongly as possible. So I want to thank you very much. I'm going to do a separate video on the economic questions. Thank you.